So welcome everyone. Today is actually not a standalone class, but the first of a series of classes on this incredible figure of Franz Rosenzweig. It's a little bit funny. Maybe I'll start out by pointing out sort of the ironies of life. When I lived outside of Israel, when I lived in Cleveland, when I was the rabbi at the shul, I found myself oftentimes focusing on rabbis or religious thinkers who were deeply tied to Israel, Zionism, Eretz Yisrael, right? Because when you're on the outside looking in, right, you're drawn to it, and that's where you find yourself focusing. You know, as we say in the tefillah, "V'techazena einenu b'shuvcha leTzion," right? We have our eyes turned towards Zion with the hope of returning. And one of the strange things that's happened since I've come here is I still very much am connected to Torah Eretz Yisrael, the Torah of the land of Israel. But at the same time, I have found myself somewhat transfixed by this German Jewish philosopher of the name of Franz Rosenzweig. And part of the reason I think that's a little ironic is that Franz Rosenzweig himself had a sort of complicated relationship with Zionism. He was not against Zionism. He kind of described himself as a non-Zionist. He just felt that Zionism, while it presented the possibility of solving a lot of the Jewish people's problems, and he wasn't against that, he also felt that it wasn't necessarily the right way to go. So it's interesting to be a rabbi connected to the land of Israel. And like I said, studying this German Jewish rabbi who spends most of his time thinking about Jewish life, particularly outside of Israel. But nevertheless, there is something about Franz Rosenzweig, which I just find unbelievable. And what we're going to hopefully do over the next several classes is give us all a sense of who this individual was, and particularly why he's important, and specifically why he's important for the way we think about Jewishness today, for the way we think about what does it mean to be a Jew, not just in the 20th century, but ultimately in the 21st century. Franz Rosenzweig is known for many things. I'll just name maybe the three highlights, and then we'll dive a little bit more into his biography, and then we'll dive more into why he's so important, and then we'll look at a bunch of texts of his from his early years to get a sense of, like I said, who he was and where he's going. So I would say Franz Rosenzweig is probably most well known for three three facts. Number one, he's born in 1886 to basically into an assimilated Reform German Jewish home in Kessel, which is a city in Germany. He is what you would call a 3-day-a-year Jew. Right? He does not go to shul very often, if at all. There's a Passover Seder. It's not clear they're even really fasting on Yom Kippur, maybe somewhat, but not completely. That's basically his religious background. And he goes on to university, where he initially studies to be a doctor. His parents are very happy that he's going to be a doctor. I should point out that he comes from a wealthy family, an upper middle class family. His father owns a factory. So like any good Jewish parents, they want their son to be a doctor. I apologize to my own parents who are listening. I could not give them that. But in the middle of his studies for medical school, he says, I don't want to be a doctor. That may be my mother's wish, but it's not what I want. And he goes on to study philosophy. Maybe I can relate to this because I was actually educated to be an engineer, and then I switched over to be a rabbi. So for him, it's not so different. He studies philosophy. He studies history. He studies the great German philosopher Hegel, who basically develops this very sophisticated notion of a philosophy of history. And he publishes his doctorate on Hegel's theory of the nation state in 1912. And he is this rising star in German academia. He's brilliant. It's clear from when he's young. You'll see it in some of his early writings when he's like a teenager. He's not just precocious, right? His brilliance is tangible to all who encounter him. So he completes his doctorate in 1912. The assumption is he's going to be a star. He is Jewish, and being a Jew in Germany at that time does limit his options. He can't necessarily get a full professorship, but it's clear whatever he's going to do, it's going to be significant. And the first major event of his life that people are aware of is that a year after he finishes his doctorate, remember I said he comes from a pretty assimilated Jewish home, but a home that his sense of Jewish identity was very strong. right? He had a sense that he was a Jew, even if he didn't really understand what it meant to be a Jew. But in 1913, what has already happened is that some of his close friends and family have converted from Judaism to Christianity, not just because they want to assimilate to Germany, but also because they see Christianity as having a historical significance in the world as the German nation continues to unfold and play this central role in history. His cousins convert, and in 1913, he's basically convinced to want to convert himself. And the dramatic moment that happens is that basically right before he's going to convert, he decides not to, and he decides to remain a Jew. And that was a very significant event, not just in his own life, but in his own public mythos. People heard about this, and it was kind of a shocking thing, right? Here was this brilliant young Jew who was going to convert, and then at the last minute he doesn't, and it's not really clear why he doesn't. That's I would say the most important first fact. This brilliant Jew who could have been a Christian but chose not to. And we talk about becoming a Christian. It's not quite the same resonance that it has for us here today. It's probably closer to somebody who was like Jewish or religious or Orthodox deciding to become secular. It's not like by becoming Christian. He was, I think for us today, that would be much harsher. It wasn't as uncommon in his time. And it was more, again, about entering a whole broader community and society than it was purely about, religious identification and switching from one religious community to another. In 1914, let me pull it up actually. You can see his nice photo here and some of the bio. In 1914, after he decides to stay Jewish, one of the things he recognizes is he doesn't know a whole lot about Judaism. And he ends up going to study in Berlin with Hermann Cohen, who is the great German Jewish philosopher. Hermann Cohen is the only Jew at the professorship in Germany at the time. He's maybe like the most famous Jew in Germany, or he's in the top 3 or 4. He's very influential philosophically. And at this point in his life, he's almost basically done with teaching in academia, and he has started to teach Jewish studies. Cohen was a classic philosopher, a neo-Kantian German idealist philosopher, but he also had a deep Jewish knowledge. And towards the end of his life, he tries to start bridging between his own philosophical studies and Judaism. So Rosenzweig goes to learn with him. He's very impacted by him, very influenced by Cohen as this very older, stately, brilliant, Jew. And it makes a big impact on him in his own Jewish journey. And then, of course, World War I breaks out, and Germany has a central role to play in World War I, for better or for worse. Rosenzweig decides to volunteer, but specifically for the Red Cross. He's ambivalent about the war, right? He had great hopes, at least earlier in his life, for Germany, potentially the world historical role of Christianity, and that it all could come together to continue this pathway towards redemption for Germany and for Europe and for the world. But World War I really ends any kind of possibility of that kind of messianism or optimism. The war is terrible for Germany, it's terrible for Europe, and it ends in a real sense of tragedy. So Rosenzweig serves in the war. He's on the front lines. I think he sees some fighting, but not a lot. And this moves us towards the second most important point of Rosenzweig's biography. Towards the end of the war, he starts writing his great philosophical work known as The Star of Redemption, which is a profound and profoundly complicated work. Clearly one of the most important Jewish philosophical works ever written. That's not even debatable, and deeply influential, not just for Jewish thinking, but for also what we call continental philosophy, philosophy in Europe, basically in the 20th century. It's a profound work, and it's worth it, even though it's often impossible at times. I was saying to Murray before we started, Rosenzweig lives at this fascinating moment, right? This is end of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. It's a moment of crisis, and it's a moment of crisis and transition. And The Star of Redemption, reflects that, right? It's sort of trying to capture what was and what might be, and to tie it all together as a way of making sense of it. And when you live in times of transition, it often allows you to be critical of what's come before, to open up the possibility for something new to exist in the future. So the second most important detail, he writes The Star of Redemption, a profoundly important work, and he does it from the front lines. He writes it in like 6-7 months, sending postcards back to his parents, and it's a monumental achievement. In 1920, a year later, He is a appointed head of the Lehrhaus in Frankfurt. And the Lehrhaus was also a bit revolutionary because it was the first center of adult Jewish learning in Germany. Right? We think of adult learning as like a common thing, right? JCCs do adult learning, synagogues do adult learning, right? Day schools do adult learning. It didn't really exist as a common feature of any kind of Jewish communal life. And the Lehrhaus is one of the first forms of it. And what made the Lehrhaus so significant was that it was a place all Jews could come and learn Torah together. Didn't matter whether you were Orthodox or not, though it was primarily geared towards people who weren't Orthodox. And the idea was come and learn Torah. And through the act of learning Torah as an individual and with other Jews, right, something's going to happen to you, right? It's going to help you move forward on your Jewish journey. Something's going to happen to you when you do that. And you do it no strings attached. You do it to come and learn. And you grapple with the text, you grapple with Torah, and perhaps even find God as part of that process. So the Lehrhaus is like a fascinating place. It's basically a Beit Midrash, but again, for all Jews. And now this moves us to the third most significant detail of Rosenzweig's life. And that's that in 1922, he's diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and it gets progressively worse over the next several years. And the last 5-6 years of his life, he is basically locked in, meaning he's locked inside his body. He cannot talk. He does manage to communicate through the help of his wife. They develop like a pad in which he can basically just move his eye and he can look at specific letters. And that's how his wife knows what he's trying to say, by composing letters to words. And through that, he actually writes dozens, if not hundreds of letters, and actually writes some additional very significant writings. So the fact that he spent the last several years of his life in this profoundly inhibited state, but somehow found the will to not only live, but to try to, again, bring Torah into the world for other Jews is a very, very significant achievement. And it certainly made an impact and left an impression on the German Jews of his time. Right? So this is just to give you, again, just some of the broad details of who he was, the times that he lived in. And I want to now dig a step deeper to understand, again, why is this German Jewish philosopher who died almost 100 years ago still relevant to us today? Because I think he is. One of the things I love about learning Rosenzweig is that when I read his writings, they feel deeply contemporary. And a lot of the questions he's dealing with and a lot of the issues he's trying to analyze are the same exact ones that if you're a Jew who takes seriously living in both the modern world and being a Jew, right, you can't help but grapple with these questions and concerns. So I want to just highlight a few points, like why is it worth it to spend time on Rosenzweig, and specifically, as we're going to focus on this year, and we're not going to look at the Star of Redemption as so much, because that would require a whole different way of doing this. It's a very complicated book, worthwhile, but complicated. We're going to focus on more of his letters and philosophical essays, and specifically around this question of his return to Judaism and why he chose to remain a Jew. And what does Judaism even look like at this point in his time for someone like him? Because I think there's a tremendous amount to learn from that experience, because in a lot of ways, as we're going to see, it's not that different from our own. So the first point I want to raise about why Rosenzweig is that he, in many, many ways, embodies the modern Jewish condition. He lives at a time, at an era, at an age, when Jews, for really the first time in eons, could fully integrate into the broader society in which they lived, especially if they chose to convert, right? As a Jew in Germany, you could be pretty integrated, almost completely. And if you're willing to convert, it was, fully, and there was nothing holding you back. And basically the question that Franz Rosenzweig has to ask himself, and all the Jews in Germany had to ask themselves, and all of us need to ask ourselves today, is what does it mean to be a Jew when being Jewish is a choice and not something forced upon you? Right? That's the question you have to ask yourself when you can leave Judaism behind. When it's easy to leave Judaism behind, when there's no cost to leave Judaism behind, right? Why stay Jewish? Why remain Jewish? Right? That's the question every Jew has to ask in the world today. But it was Rosenzweig's generation that fully really had to grapple with it for the first time. And it means that he's dealing with it in the most serious of ways. What's interesting to keep in mind is that when you look at the history of modernity and the Jews, particularly in Europe, going back to the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, right? You see this slow progression of Jews becoming more integrated into the societies in which they live, right? If you think back to France, right? French Jews are the first Jewish community to be emancipated under Napoleon, right? To be able to participate as, like French citizens, or maybe not even during Napoleon. I mean, it begins with the revolution, but specifically more well known with Napoleon. So that process continues over the next century plus. But the story of Jewish modernity in Europe is, for the most part, when Jews are shown the doors out of the Jewish community, when they're shown the possibility that you can leave the Jewish community and go somewhere else, the dominant narrative is that Jews run for the exits, right? That's what you see again and again throughout modernity, throughout emancipations. You see Jews, when they're given the opportunity not to be Jews, that's where they run. And the irony of that, of course, is that, well, in some ways, maybe assimilation isn't as problematic as it was in America right now as it was at different periods of time. We all know that that's the general tendency. When Jews are given the choice not to be Jews, most Jews seem to kind of go that way. So if that's the reality that Rosenzweig is living with, right, it says something very significant about our own time. And the very fact that Rosenzweig didn't just have the option of not being Jewish, but confronted it very, very seriously, but chose to remain a Jew, like I said, says something about our own condition. Because whether we ask that question or not, on some level, we have to, if we are going to continue to be Jewish, because we have alternatives, we have options. That's the first point. Rosenzweig's life and his story and his writings very much embody the dilemmas and tensions of the modern Jewish condition, that ability to leave. And to be a Jew is to be a Jew by choice on some level. That's point one. Point two about why Rosenzweig and why it's relevant to us is that the other piece you see in Rosenzweig's writings, and it's related to the first point, is that he very much feels himself caught between worlds, caught between a Jewish and Christian world, caught between a Jewish and German world. And he identifies with both of those worlds. And we'll see some of that in the class today. And he's not willing to give up on his connection to either one. And this is, I think, a really important point, because as Rosenzweig becomes a baal teshuvah, as he becomes more and more religious and more committed, he's not the kind of baal teshuvah who says, you know what, I'm going to become religious and abandon everything from my previous life, right? That's the way a lot of people become religious. They imagine you have to make a clean break, right? You got to abandon all those things that you did before that were problematic, that were secular, that were American, that were Jewish. Get rid of them, jettison it, embrace your Jewishness fully, right? But that's not Rosenzweig, right? He actually writes about this. We'll see it in a couple classes, right? To make the return to Judaism, to be a baal teshuvah, cannot mean jettisoning everything that you were before. Can't mean making a clean break. Because to be a modern Jew means to live in multiple worlds and to have those as part of ourselves, whether we like it or not. And part of why Rosenzweig resonates so strongly, especially with me, is because his description of being a German Jew, of being caught between Judaism and Jewishness and Germanness, Judaism and Christianity, resonates very much with the way I often experience and the way I think most people experience. What does it mean to be modern Orthodox or religious Zionist, right? To be caught between two worlds, modern and Orthodox, and feel that on some level, if you are to have to choose one over the other, that it's going to fundamentally violate who you are. They're both part of you. You can't just, like I said, jettison one of them and expect to keep on living. And Rosenzweig actually makes this point in a really beautiful way, or a very powerful way, at least. He writes in one of his letters how he was once interviewing at a Jewish school for some teaching position, presumably. And, again, just like we often debate, are we Jewish or are we American, right? Are we Israeli or are we Jewish, right? These split identities that we carry, and always being confronted, feeling like we have to choose one or the other. So when he was interviewing for this position, the question was raised about the German and Jewishness, right? And I think he was basically asked, like, which one do you choose? Like, which one is most important to you? And here's what he says. I'll read the quote. I didn't actually put it here on the slides. He says, I would refuse to answer the question if I was asked to choose one or the other, my German or my Jewishness. If life were at one stage to torment me and tear me into two pieces, then I would naturally know with which of the two halves the heart which is, after all, asymmetrically positioned, would side. I would also know that I would not be able to survive the operation. And what he's saying here is, if you want me to choose between my Jewish and my Germanness, you're going to have to tear me apart. But I won't live afterwards. Like, I have to have both of these. And he points out too, if you cut somebody in half, right, the heart is not in the middle, right? The heart's on the left side. So if you cut somebody in half, you'll figure out which side the heart was on. But they'll be dead at that point. And what Rosenzweig is saying here is that these two pieces are part of himself, whether he likes it or not. And to be a Jew can't mean fundamentally giving up those other dimensions of himself. We'll see how he continues to relate to them. It doesn't mean, obviously, saying that they take priority over Judaism either, but it can't necessarily be just getting rid of it. And for Rosenzweig, one of the major themes throughout all of his thought, all of his writings, is this idea of contradiction and the ability or the willingness to maintain contradiction, to embrace contradiction. Right? The Star of Redemption is great philosophical work. It's all about the drama of God, human beings, and creation and world, God, man, and world, and the relationships between them. And for Rosenzweig, God, man, and the world are all fundamentally unique. Each one is fundamentally different from the other and stands on its own. But nonetheless, all three fundamentally are in relationship with each other. God's in relationship to human beings, right? That's called revelation. God created the world, that's creation. And human beings are in relation to creation, to the world, that's called redemption, right? That each one of these pieces can be in relationship with each other, even though they're fundamentally different and contradictory. And we know this, right? Human beings and God, they couldn't be more different, yet somehow they can be in relationship. And that really captures, I would say, like I said, a central theme for Rosenzweig, this idea that things that are opposites, things that shouldn't be able to exist together, can somehow be in relationship with each other. And he knows that because he sees it inside of himself just as much as he sees it in his relationships with others, right? The very fact that two human beings can be in a relationship with each other is almost an impossible thing. So Adiv asked a really good question here. He said, do you imply that being German may suggest also being Christian? The short answer is yes. For Rosenzweig, it does. And we're going to see why that is. That wouldn't necessarily be true today, but in his time, that was absolutely the case. The next point I want to make. So first point was Rosenzweig embodies the modern Jewish condition. Second point is that he is caught between worlds, Jewish and Christian, Jewish and German. And to choose would mean tearing himself apart, which is something we can all identify with. And then the third point is this question about what does it mean to be a baal teshuvah? And really the idea that we are all baal teshuvah, whether we grew up religious or not today, because there's something fundamentally different about the Jewish condition today from what our great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents experienced. And that difference is very significant. So what do I mean when I say that we're all baal teshuvah today? So for the Jew before modernity, Judaism was a fact, an undeniable fact of one's existence, right? The sky was blue, the grass is green, and you were a Jew. It just is what it is. Being Jewish was something that you absorbed naturally in the home, primarily from your parents. You lived only with Jews, your friends were Jews, the rhythms of your life were Jewish. It wasn't something you even questioned because, like I said, it was like the sky being blue. It is what it is. All that changes after modernity. Suddenly, the Jewish tradition is not one's natural way of life, right? There's a fundamental rupture, a disruption, and this closed Jewish world suddenly opens. It opens up to all these different possibilities, right? One has alternative ways of being in the world. And instead of being a fact like the color of the sky, Judaism, as I said, now one option amongst others. And when Judaism loses its taken for grantedness in modernity, our relationship to the tradition changes, and it changes in a significant way. So there's a professor at Yeshiva University, Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, who is Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's son. He writes extensively about this, where he compares the pre-modern Jewish experience. The tradition was passed down mimetically, right? You learned what the tradition was because you saw your parents living it, and that's what you did. You just, imbibe it. It's osmosis. You absorb it. However, in modernity, we transition away from a mimetic tradition, a tradition of just Judaism as a natural way of life that you take on, to a textual tradition, right? Instead, Judaism turns to how do you know how to be Jewish? you don't watch your parents, you open up a book. And that part of that significance is because Jews no longer, as I said, just live Judaism as this natural thing. It's just total natural way of being. And if the question is, how do you know how to be Jewish? You got to open up a book and read it. Well, then again, that changes our Judaism. It's no longer something naturally internal to us, and it's now something external to us, right? I have to look to outside of me, and I'm almost alienated from it to be able to understand it. Now, Jews have always loved learning, and Jews have always obsessed about texts. But when you only can experience the tradition through a text, because there's no natural repository for it that you can just turn to and know how to be Jewish because of it, again, that's a very, very different kind of Jewish experience. And this, like I said, to be a Jew at this point, when you can't take it for granted, it's a choice. It requires some level of an ongoing commitment. It's not this, like I said, this fact of life, this brute fact that you have to just have to live with. And like I said, this leads us to our next important point about Rosenzweig and all of us, is that Rosenzweig wasn't just immersed in German culture. He achieved the intellectual peak of it, meaning he was the peak. He did a doctorate in Hegel. He was a brilliant scholar, right? He reached the peak of that intellectual culture. He kind of saw all there was to see and to understand. I mean, I don't want to say he knew everything, but he understood the depths of that culture pretty much as far as you can go intellectually. He was a brilliant man with an incredible grasp of philosophy and history. And yet he lives, as I said, at this transition point. He lives after Nietzsche has proclaimed the death of God. And if you know anything about Nietzsche, what Nietzsche means there isn't that human beings like went up to heaven and killed God. It means that we live in a secular time when we don't need the idea of God to make sense of the world. That's essentially what Nietzsche means. Like we have reason, the world has become disenchanted. We know why things are the way they are. And if not completely, we know that we'll figure out it someday, right? So to live when Rosenzweig lives is to live at a time where even just a belief in God it's not just that it's not natural, it's not provable, right? We don't need a belief in God to live and to be human and to be modern. And what that means is that the decision to be religious, it's not just that we have options and therefore you got to choose to be Jewish. The whole idea of being Jewish, being religious, having faith, living one's faith in the world, kind of becomes a little bit absurd by the beginning of the 20th century. And the truth is, it's kind of absurd still today. Right? There are I hate to break it to people, and I say this sometimes, and maybe because I'm no longer a shul rabbi, I can say this directly. There are no proofs for God's existence, right? Like it doesn't exist. If they do exist, I would love to know them, because if they do exist, we should be running around proclaiming them for all to hear. There are no absolute proofs for God's existence. That's one of the things that it means to be modern and to live in the time that we live. And if that's the case, then to be religious is going to have to look and feel different in some way than it did for our grandparents or our great-grandparents. And the fact that Rosenzweig turned away from the peak of the intellectual achievements of German culture, philosophical, scientific, turned his back. He didn't turn his back on it, but he recognized that it had its limits, and to turn and also to embrace religion, to embrace faith, and recognize that theology and philosophy need each other, was a profound achievement on his part. He recognizes that faith is going to have to be built on something else than it had been perhaps in the past. And this is maybe for me the most interesting dimension of his thought. And at the same time, as much as he realizes that religiosity has to look different, he also recognizes that reform and orthodoxy are not without their very serious problems. He's a big critic of his reform assimilated upbringing. He sees it as pretty empty and vapid. But he's also, as much as he begins to embrace religious observance and halacha and mitzvot, he's also critical of orthodoxy, because he sees orthodoxy and modernity as a modern construct. As orthodoxy literally is not a Jewish term, right? It comes from Christian. It's a modern idea, right, that puts an emphasis on correct belief. That's literally what the term means. And part of what happens to orthodoxy and modernity, or Judaism that becomes orthodox and modernity, is this emphasis on belief, is this emphasis on authority, right? Is this emphasis on the rabbis who know the truth, and we have to kind of get in line and submit to whatever halacha demands of us. All right, so Rosenzweig is trying to walk this very complicated line in a world in which God's not obvious. God's existence is not far from obvious between reform and orthodoxy. Again, I don't want to call him an orthodox thinker because he would never call himself that. He does live by the end of his life with even if not practically a full shomer mitzvos, he is committed to shomer mitzvos, to the idea of what that means, and that is the way to be a Jew. Again, he's balancing all these tensions, all these contradictions, all these problematics, and trying to weave it all together in a way that's coherent and meaningful. And I'll just make one more point is that, I grew up, the home I grew up in was much more religious than Rosenzweig. We went to shul every week. We kept Shabbos pretty much, if not entirely. We kept kashrut, but I also went to public school. And I also knew growing up what it was like to live between worlds. And for me, I reached a certain point, especially in college and after college, right, where I had to ask myself, like, what kind of Jewish life do I want to live? And I have alternatives. And for me, I didn't know who Rosenzweig was then, I don't think. But for me, there was a real choice that had to be made. And that sense of returning to the tradition, and again, whatever that means, was something very, very important for me personally. And to see Rosenzweig, again, not just that he lived that or that he did that, but that his whole life's work is trying to grapple with what that means and why it might be necessary. Why being a baal teshuvah may be the most important thing a Jew can be at any time. And why that's important, not just for the Jewish relationship with God, but ultimately to the Jewish people and to the world and to the very idea of redemption itself, which, obviously is a big idea for him. If you name your book that way, then obviously it says a lot about what you think of its significance. So I want to transition. We're going to look at some texts of Rosenzweig before we wrap up. I'm just going to read this briefly. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but I wanted to just capture a little bit about what makes Rosenzweig so significant. Gershom Scholem, the great 20th century scholar of Jewish mysticism, born and raised in Germany, moves to Israel in the after World War I, I think. I can't remember if it was before or after World War I. No, it must be after World War I, sorry. And he professor at Hebrew University, probably the greatest scholar of Jewish studies in the 20th century. I think I'm not sure anybody else has that title besides him. He knew Rosenzweig. He met Rosenzweig in Germany. They had mutual friends, and they sort of traveled in similar intellectual circles. And Scholem writes in his autobiography about some of his encounters with Rosenzweig. And Rosenzweig has letters that he wrote to Scholem. They weren't good friends. In fact, Rosenzweig is a little critical of Scholem in some of his writings, but they knew each other, and it was significant in that way. And what Scholem writes here is that Rosenzweig, from the time that he first met him, Rosenzweig's brilliance was just absolutely apparent to Scholem. Like, this was a person who just stood out whatever room he was in. And he also acknowledges that the Star of Redemption is the most important Jewish philosophical work of the 20th century and probably beyond. And so when you have the greatest scholar of Jewish studies saying these things, like, it gives you a sense of who he was, right? Who Rosenzweig was at the end of the day. And Jacques Derrida, who writes on some of Scholem's writings, he makes this important point based on Scholem's arguments, right? The very last line here, Scholem he calls Rosenzweig a man of genius, and he notes that in his time, it's already becoming not so fashionable to refer to people as geniuses. Right? Genius is a certain romantic idea. The genius is somebody who stands out and can sort of be creative in ways that others cannot. They're visionary, they're imaginative. They can sort of almost create something out of nothing, right? And the idea of the genius kind of falls out of fashion because instead of seeing genius as being that which sets history in motion, right, we tend to assume that there's always sort of an imminent cause for everything. Meaning, if something happens, it's because there's something before it that precedes it, right? So we no longer look at individuals or historical phenomenon as being sui generis, as they say, right? Like fundamentally, of their own. And Scholem is already bothered by the idea that we would assume that like genius isn't a thing. He says, I regard the abolition of this category, which is popular today, the category of genius, as altogether foolish, and the reasons adduced for it as valueless. Meaning people want to get rid of this idea of genius. Scholem's like, you can't do that because there's something true about it. And essentially Rosenzweig was one of those kinds of truly unique people. And Derrida picks up on this because what he notes is that we today in the modern world don't like the idea of singularity. We don't like the idea of the fact that something or someone could be fundamentally different from everything else in a way that we can't fully explain, right? That they just stand out, right? There's just something about it or them that just makes them stand out and be different from everything else. And Derrida points out we get rid of that concept in a way, almost out of an attempt to flatten the world, to make everything kind of the same. But this idea of being singular, of being a singularity, isn't something that we should dismiss so lightly. Rosenzweig himself emphasizes this idea in very, very significant ways, which we're not going to get into right now. But for our purposes, Rosenzweig was a singularity. He was unlike anybody and anything else. Like he was like a comet across the sky, and people could see that. Didn't always know what to do with it. It doesn't mean he was always he wasn't a tzaddik. I'm not saying he was always like a this ethical paragon or this moral exemplar, but he was a comet across the sky. And as is the case with most great figures, right, they are larger than life. And that was very much Rosenzweig. So I just want to put that out there because, again, we're dealing with somebody who is unlike, most others before or after him. Now, in terms of understanding Rosenzweig's early years and where he comes from and this being caught between German and Jewishness, we're going to look at a couple of selections from letters that he writes to his parents. And the first excerpt from a letter that we'll look at, this is 1905. He's in college. Rosenzweig's letters are just beautiful, a lot of them, and very interesting in their own right. They're all like little philosophical essays. But this particular one is significant because he's writing to his parents about the experience of pledging a Jewish fraternity, right? Jews go to college and they often think about, pledging fraternities. And what's interesting, because it was true both in Rosenzweig's time and our own, is that college is often, for him, it was like his first major encounter with people who aren't Jewish, right? Like as you're growing up, you're just with Jews and suddenly college opens up and you meet all these people and have all these different kinds of experiences. And that was certainly true for Rosenzweig as well. So for him, college is a full encounter with German society and culture. Before that, his environment was pretty Jewish, pretty insular. So when describing this, he goes to the frat to pledge. He doesn't actually join the frat, if I remember correctly, but here's how he describes his experience at the Jewish fraternity. He says, rather dismally, the following. Last night, I found rather pleasant being at the fraternity, so far as I care for this kind of thing at all. The people as individuals were nice looking and well-mannered, very few typically Jewish-looking young men, some of the handsome racial type, about half with marked traits, meaning some looked Jewish, but not everybody did. The prevailing tone, exactly the same as amongst Christian students, which is meant neither as praise nor censure. Even the beer-drinking code showed no trace of a Jewish esprit, like a Jewish spirit. It was just the opposite. After this test, racial anti-Semitism seems to me more senseless than ever before. These people, at least at their present age, as completely German students as can be imagined. So here's what he's saying. I went to the Jewish fraternity and I looked around and nobody really looked Jewish, right? Like it looked like most other fraternities you would go visit. And that's significant for a few reasons here. Number one is he's acknowledging the fact that assimilated Jews and Germans really aren't that different, but they're really all kind of one and the same. And he's pointing out that this is part of what makes anti-Semitism so absurd, because if the Jews are really just like Germans, then why would they be hated for in any way whatsoever? But what we see here is as he's encountering the broader German world, and he's recognizing his own assimilation and the other Jews' assimilation. And he says here, they're no different than Christians. And he says it's not praise or censure, but he's noting it, right? There's a certain level of ambivalence here about this. He doesn't know quite what to do with it. And as we'll see in these early texts, you'll see somebody who very much understands their Jewishness, but is also recognizing there's other possibilities out there. And recognizing those possibilities aren't even so far into him. The next letters we'll look at are in this.
But isn't this an example of what you were saying before? Basically, what he's saying is just look around, and he's asking the question that you pinpointed. Why is it that I need to be Jewish? What are the reasons? And the way I see that letter is that he's confused.
Yeah,
I'm looking.
I think that's correct.
What's going on, and I'm asking myself, why? why do I even have to bother?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Implicit in that letter is him raising for the question the first time, why be Jewish, right? Like you're absolutely right. And that question we're going to see is going to thread through all of his early writings. That letter from 1905, he is 19 years old when he writes it.
Yeah.
And so the next letter is from 1923. And these two letters are in response to the fact that his first cousin, Hans Ehrenberg, has decided to convert. His first cousin, Hans Ehrenberg, grew up in an assimilated Jewish home like him, but Hans decides to convert, and Franz's parents freak out, and Franz Rosenzweig isn't so bothered by the fact that his cousin is converting. And we'll see how he's grappling with that. He says here, Hans is still in Berlin. I really see nothing shameful in the whole matter. This fact that he's decided to convert doesn't really bother Franz. Franz takes the contrarian position, right? Instead of sympathizing with his parents, oh, I get it. It's upsetting. It's almost like Hans is marrying a shiksa. That's probably the best way to like conceptualize this. It's like he's marrying a non-Jew. That would be our contemporary parallel, right? They're all upset about it. And Rosenzweig saying, what's the big deal? Like I see nothing shameful about this, right? Like he should be able to choose to live how he wants. And he even goes on to say, it's an excellent thing, after all, to be able to make contact with religion, even somewhat late. Meaning, like, it's wonderful that Hans has found religion, even if it's a little bit later in life, because religion is meaningful. I didn't highlight it here, but many of the early writings of Rosenzweig, we'll see it also at the end. He is somebody who has a deep religious sensibility. He is somebody who's thinking about God, thinking about Judaism, even as when he's young. He may only be like a 3-day-a-year Jew, but he is a deeply spiritually minded person. So it's not that he wasn't thinking about religious questions and then woke up to it. He's always been thinking about them, even if he didn't always have the tools and the depth to really, understand them fully. So when he praises saying religion's a good thing here, he's not just saying it, he actually means it. It's something that he's thinking about too, to one extent or another. He goes on, he says, even if someone finds it late, if only for the sake of one's children, when one has been robbed of it by early neglect, right? Like it's better to find it late, but it's obviously would it be even better if you could be given religion when you're young, when you still can really, grow into it and be part of you. He says, of course, it would have been best if uncle and aunt had their children baptized or circumcised at birth, but it's better to repair the omission belatedly than not at all. Meaning his aunt and uncle, like they barely raised their kids Jewish, even less than Rosenzweig. And so I was like saying, it would have been better if they just sort of raised Hans Jewish or raised him Christian, as opposed to like kind of leaving him adrift, and now he has to kind of choose as an adult. But then he goes on to say something very interesting. He says, because I am hungry, must I in principle go on being hungry? On principle, does principle satisfy a hunger? What he's saying here is if Hans was raised, or Franz himself was raised with a Judaism that was basically empty, right? That wasn't worth anything because there was no substance there, then there's no life there, then does that mean they have to stay committed to it forever, even though it's like this empty thing, right? That's crazy. Like I should just stay a Jew to make my parents happy, even though their Jewishness is nothing and my Jewishness is nothing. Like that's insane, right? You can imagine that kind of conversation easily happening today, in America. Can being non-religious on principle satisfy a religious need? Like it's better to be a non-religious Jew than to be a religious Christian. Like that's the basic argument here, that he's pointing out how absurd that is. Or can the empty notation in the registrar's office, religion Jewish, satisfy a religious need? It's like, fine, for my parents, like the high point of being Jewish is that when you go to the registrar's office, it says on your like ID card that you're Jewish, right? That's what Jewishness means to them, no more than that, no less. If I'm given the choice of an empty purse or a handful of money, must I choose the purse, again on principle? And what he does here is he's comparing Judaism to an empty purse, right? It's basically empty. It's a shell. There's really not much left to it in the way that he's experiencing it in his own life and his own family. And he's basically saying to his parents, like, someone's got to hold on to this empty shell. Like, why would you? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If religion can be this profound thing that brings meaning to people's lives, why should I commit to it just on principle, just to make you happy? Or why should Hans do that? Right. And so that's him really grappling with these questions, exactly as Murray pointed out. In the next letter, he also is grappling with his parents just a couple of days later. His parents wanted Hans to visit like a rabbi, right? Like every good Jewish parent, like when their son's going to our daughter's going to do something bad, like intermarry or leave the religion, it's like, oh, we'll bring them to the rabbi. The rabbi will solve it. I think I only had like had to have one of those conversations in my my decade as a rabbi. I thank God I did not have to have more than one, because it's impossible. Like, somebody's made the decision. I don't even think I could try to convince somebody who was like, didn't want to be Jewish to be Jewish. If they really felt it sincerely, to try to talk them out of it just to make their parents happy or just to stay loyal to a tradition, which, as Rosenzweig said, is like an empty wallet for them. I mean, that to me seems, seems crazy. So his parents wished Hans had gone to visit the rabbi. Rosenzweig says, you're crazy. Like, that wouldn't have done anything whatsoever. And here's how he describes it. He says, about Hans, we simply don't see eye to eye. What you say about 3 visits to a theologian, you should have gone visit the rabbi 3 times, won't hold water. Not even 300 visits would have changed things. We are Christian in everything. We live in a Christian state, attend Christian schools, read Christian books, ensure our whole culture rests entirely on a Christian foundation. Consequently, a man who has nothing holding him back needs only a very slight push to basically choose to become Christian. The 3 visits to make him accept Christianity. In Germany today, the Jewish religion cannot be accepted. It has to be grafted on by circumcision, dietary observance, and bar mitzvah, right? Like, there's no natural way to be Jewish. There's no self-evident way to be Jewish. We have these like few rituals that we hold on to, and that's basically it. Christianity, however, it's the broader culture, right? So to be a Christian means to be part of a broader culture, right? It's like being a Jew in Israel. Like, it's easy to be a Jew in Israel because the culture is Jewish. Right? You don't have to work at that identity, right? The same thing is the case for being a Christian in Germany. And this goes back to Adib's point, right? Is to be German to be Christian? It's basically the way that Rosenzweig experiences it. And he goes on to say here, he says, Christianity has a tremendous advantage over Judaism, meaning because you're part of this broader life world of Christianity being in Germany. It would have been entirely out of the question for Hans to become a Jew. A Christian, however, he can become. He doesn't know how to become a Jew, right? Jew's an empty wallet, right? There's nothing there. He wouldn't even know how to be a Jew if he wanted to be. And of course, Rosenzweig is hinting to himself here too. It's not just talking about Hans. But he knows how to become a Christian because there's a broader Christian society out there he can participate in. And Rosenzweig says this is the line where he kind of he twists the knife, and every rebellious child has probably done this before. I'm sure my parents are on the line; they can attest to this, right? To let you know how serious I am about this, that Hans did the right thing. I myself counseled Hans strongly in this direction, and I would do it again, right? Like he's really sticking it to his parents here. But it's a philosophical argument that has a lot of justice to it. I mean, he's not saying anything here that you can easily disagree with, right? And you see his own ambivalence about Judaism. Why be Jewish, right? To be a Jew means to make a choice on some way, and there has to be a reason for that, whatever that reason could be. And like force Hans to stay Jewish just to stay Jewish doesn't make any sense. So this is the ambivalence about his Jewishness. I do want to give you one more text before we can.
Can I say something before you go on?
Yeah, sure.
I guess I'm not thinking that this is ambivalence. I'm thinking that he's given up hope. He's saying that at this moment in 1909, I can't conceive of a structure, of a philosophy that supports Judaism. I can't.
Right. So
I've given up hope.
There's definitely some truth to that. It's not as absolutist. He tends to speak. It's a little with him. He's hyperbolic always. Like when he takes a position, he tries to make it as like strong, run to the extreme on it. He's doing that on purpose. I'll give you one letter that's from a month later. And again, you'll see here that he wants Judaism to be something. This is going to be very clear in the next letter. And you're going to see he feels a connection to Judaism. But like you said, like what's the point of it? He's struggling with. So he's not saying Judaism is this thing you could just throw away like it's garbage. He's just saying that like I feel it means something, but if I don't know what it means, how can I continue it? Like and if it's all you can point me to is an empty wallet, then how can I make a life out of that? So here's another letter where you see his interest in Jewish education, which is going to be a lifetime pursuit for him, right? That he thinks a lot about educational questions, about shaping Jewish identity. And you'll see how he describes it here. He's thinking about it with his parents. He's criticizing, like he got the worst version of Hebrew school growing up. That was it. And he realizes how empty that is. And he's trying to imagine, like, what would it have to be to make Jewish life meaningful? He says, however, it doesn't rest with the children, but with the parents. I should point out here, again, he's really going after his parents. Look, there's an intergenerational conflict here. There's an Oedipal conflict here. right? He sees his parents as kind of like betraying the tradition. They didn't have nothing to pass on to him. And like, what am I supposed to do about this? And he says, it doesn't rest with the children, with the parents. But if you want to raise Jews, it starts with the parents. And this was true then, and it's certainly, true now. And religious instruction, religious education is of no avail, at least to us, without a religion that is seen, heard, tasted, and visibly exercised upon the body, right? It starts with the parents, and they have to model a religion that is real, a religion that is alive, a religion that you can like feel and taste, and it's there, whether you deny it or not. Remember I said before, right? Sky is blue, grass is green, you're a Jew, right? That's the kind of lived experience that has to be passed on and has to be in the home for Jewishness to be real and to be meaningful. With the Christians, it's different, right? As he already talked about, they're in a Christian society. They can kind of like Israeli Jews, the secular Israeli Jews can kind of absorb Judaism by osmosis. But as a Jew in the diaspora, that doesn't work. He says, I grant that obligatory instruction would be a great step forward, and perhaps this should be made the hub of our religious political demands. Compared with this, the legal status of our communities is unimportant. For what is the use of the most perfect organization of Jews if there are no Jews left to be organized? He's criticizing the fact that the German Jewish communities are obsessed with their, they need to get funds from the government, they need to get recognition from the government, but they're not focused on Jewish education, right? He's saying like all this like community organizing, all this like, all the big campaign, and all they do is none of it's really dedicated to Jewish education. Instead of worrying about, the government, acknowledging Jewish communal rights, the Jewish community should really be focusing on getting the government to give funds so that the Jews can educate themselves. And it's possible in Germany. I mean, the German government gives money to the different religious confessions to educate their people. So he's not wrong here. So you see somebody who wants Jewishness to be real. He wants it to be alive, something you can taste, you can experience in the home. That's where it should ideally be. And it's simply not there. And he wants to, this is a problem he identifies. It's a problem he wants to solve in some way, but he's, again, struggling, if at all, to know how to do that. And I'll give you one more quote. He says, this also in his journal from around the same time or the next year. My Judaism is fundamentally and dogmatically different from the Judaism of our times, right? He feels a profound connection to Judaism that he can't fully explain, but he also recognizes it's different from other people. Reform, Orthodox, whatever they got going on is different from what Rosenzweig senses Judaism is supposed to be. And of course, he doesn't fully yet know what to do with that. The last text we'll look at before we wrap up.
But isn't that a sign? Isn't that note a sign that he's now in the process of trying to develop his philosophy? My religion.
The seeds are there, but it takes him a while. I mean, the seeds are always there with him, and we're going to see it even in his initial letters that he writes after he chooses not to convert. Contain, we're not going to be, I can't really show you this if we don't have the time, but we'll look at some of the letters. You'll see they contain a lot of the philosophical kernel of the Star of Redemption. Yeah. Right. So he's thinking this all the time. He's struggling with these questions, trying to work stuff out. And you see it again and again in his journal and his letters. He's constantly trying to work through these ideas. He's obsessed with it. He's trying to make sense of this. So the last text I want us to look at, because again, we were seeing sort of the ambivalence of Rosenzweig, right? The judgment of Judaism not being alive. So I want to show you a text, a very interesting text that I think actually captures like the whole Rosenzweig approach. And it's a significant text because it was written in 1900. So if he's born in 1886, he's 14 years old when he writes this. It's a letter to Gertrude and Helena Frank, who are essentially, I think, family friends, if I remember correctly, or cousins. And he offers a fictional story to them. It's a Kafkaesque story. And I use that term for multiple reasons. Most importantly, because Kafka was a German Jew, right? Kafka's a German Jew. He's a contemporary of Rosenzweig. He knew of Rosenzweig. He was at the Lehrhaus periodically, Kafka himself, I think, if I remember correctly. Maybe that's not true. I don't remember if that's 100% true. But Kafka's becomes a well-known figure in this time. Rosenzweig certainly knows who he is, and they're struggling with similar issues. But what makes the story Kafkaesque is it's a bit strange what's going on here, and we're not totally quite sure what to make of it. So you're going to see Rosenzweig's sort of creativity and genius in this, and I'll show you how it reflects a lot of the questions and ideas that he's going to be struggling with his whole life. So this is at age 14 that he writes this, and it's essentially a fictional story. He says during the 12th year of Wilhelm II's reign, Wilhelm II was the last emperor, last Kaiser of Germany, who gives up his position after World War I. So in the 12th year of his reign, the heavens opened and an image of God appeared. Because the sin of the city of Kelm came before God. In it, the Jewish people had gone out and danced around the golden tree. God sent his angel to punish the city. The angel came to the post office and saw many letters placed there. So let me just unpack this one step at a time. 12th year of Wilhelm II's realm, in the city of Kelm, the heavens open up and God appears. And why do the heavens open up and God appear? Because the sin of the city comes before God. And this language is significant. It comes from the German. It's not written in Hebrew or English. It was German initially, but it echoes the language of the sin of stone coming before God, right? And that God has to go down and like judge the city, right? So Kelm and stone are sort of being made parallel here. And what was the sin of Kelm? No, it wasn't like stone, but it was that the Jews had gone out and danced around the golden tree. What he's referring to here is the fact that the Jews in the city kept Christmas, which was not unusual at that time. Christmas, not as a religious holiday, but Christmas is like a cultural holiday. And when God sees the Jews keeping Christmas, right, dancing around the golden tree, that's a problem. And the reference here is also to the golden calf, right, the Egel Zahav, right? Jews are almost like abandoning Judaism to worship the idol, and obviously that makes God very, very angry. So what does God do? God sends the angel down to exact punishment, revenge. We'll have to see. So the angel comes to the post office and sees many letters placed there. Okay, why is the angel going to the post office? That's not the first place you might think the angel to go. If this is the angel of death, right? You'd think he'd be running to the homes like on Pesach, right? Striking down the Jews, but instead he goes to the post office. And what does the angel do there? The angel touches the stamps on the envelopes and said, abit, which in translation means go away. So what the angel does, he goes to the post office, says this word, and all the stamps disappear. All the stamps on the letters disappear. And that's a problem, right? Because if you want to mail things, they got to have stamps on it. And now we have an issue. So what happens next? The angel witnesses immediately all the stamps disappear, the red, the green, and the blue. But cries broke out and rose up from every quarter of the city, right? And again, you can hear the echoes of Pesach here, right? The angel of death is like striking people down. There's cries in the city. Same here too, but it's not people, it's stamps. Because the servants of Fod, the son of Bielski, who had been appointed by the Kaiser over all the postal workers, collected from those who received the letters double the charge of the stamp. So what happened is that the post office went to deliver the letters for all the Jews. And when the letters were brought to the Jews' homes, right, this is their mail, right, the Jews couldn't just receive them because the letters didn't have a stamp. The stamp had disappeared. So what the Jews had to do was pay double, right? If you wanted to get your mail, right, you had to pay double, right? That was it. Right. So at first glance, like, what the heck's going on here? This isn't some big punishment, right? Why are people crying out? It's not such a big deal. The story continues. Towards Fod's pocket, Fod is the head of the post office, streamed the silver coins like a river to the southern hills. The people of Kelm were terrified and regretted their sins. And God spoke to them and said, throw away your trees into the fire and worship me, which is again from Yeshayahu, right? This idea of throw away the idols into the flames or whatever. The Jews did this, and God's countenance never departed from them. The people of Kelm never again aroused God's anger upon them, so as not to force the one who had forgiven them to cause further punishments. Meaning the Jews learned their lesson, right? After having to pay double the stamp cost, right? They returned to God, and they never aroused God's anger again because they didn't want to be punished. And the letter was signed, this fictional story, Franz, son of George, the prophet of Kessel, right? So he's 14 when he writes this. But there's a lot of like really interesting things going on here. So first off, he's reflecting on the fact, already at the age of 14, that they are like Jews, they're German Jews who are like fully immersed in a broader culture, which isn't really Jewish. And he feels that conflict and that tension. They're keeping Christmas. Theodore Herzl writes openly in his diaries from around the same time, basically, or a little earlier maybe, that like he had a Christmas tree, again, as a secular kind of holiday. Right, so the Jews are keeping Christmas, and that bothers Rosenzweig. I don't know if Rosenzweig had a Christmas tree or something. I don't believe he did, but he sees it, he recognizes it, it bothers him already at 14. 14-year-olds are sensitive to hypocrisy. They get it at that point. Ask my parents. Once they hit a certain age, they they're going to point it all out. So he sees the conflict, the contradiction, and it bothers him. But the whole thrust of the story here is not that you should go choose Christianity or abandon Jewishness. Or the whole thrust of the story is here, how do we get the Jews back to Judaism? And it clearly affirms this idea that Jews should be Jewish, right? And so you can see here already emerging, right? Rosenzweig feels the contradiction, feels the ambivalence, but he wants to be Jewish. That's the point, right? The question is, how do we get back to that? Now, the mechanism in the story to get people back is this idea of the stamps, right? Which is this strange detail. Why is it the no stamps? How does that get the Jews to, if we want to be anti-Semitic, we could say, well, if you want to hit a Jew the hardest, like take away their money or charge them extra taxes, right? Like pay extra fees, make them pay retail and not wholesale, right? Like that's the best way to get them to change things. So you can read it like cynically that way. And I don't think I think he intends that to one extent or another. But what it also reflects here is this idea that if you're Jewish, like you're never going to be fully participating just like everybody else in society, right? Things are always going to be out of step for you, right? The mail is supposed to work like clockwork. You put the stamp on, it gets where it's supposed to go. But when you're a Jew living in whatever modern culture you live in, whether it's America or wherever else, right? On some level, you're out of step. On some level, you don't quite fit. And if you lose that sense of being out of step, of not quite fitting in, right? Of being different, right? Then you've kind of lost your Jewishness in some fundamental way. So when the Jews have to pay double, it's a recognition, again, that there's something missing. There's something different, right? They're not just part of German Jewish society. And the question is, how can they, grapple with that? There's no content to Jewishness in here other than turning back to God, which I think is significant. It's not an empty Jewishness. There's a profoundly religious component to it. But what does it mean to be Jewish in the story? It means don't be an idol worshiper, don't be Christian, right? That's the sum total of it. So you see all these biblical references, all this struggling with what it means to be Jewish. And the last thing I'll point out, and then I'll finish, is that how does he sign this letter? The prophet of Kessel, right? He's calling himself a prophet, right? And what's the job of prophets, right? When the Jewish people go astray, it's to find a way to bring them back to God. And there's something very profound about that, of thinking of Rosenzweig as a prophetic figure. He doesn't describe himself ever that way. And this idea of prophecy is a big theme in 20th century Jewish thought. And there were rabbis and mystics who very much thought of themselves in sort of a prophetic mode. Generally, Rosenzweig doesn't talk about himself that way or is thinking that way, but it absolutely is that, right? He is a prophetic figure who desperately wants to bring people back to God. And everything we're going to see going forward is his attempt to try to think through what that means. And to be a prophet, going back to what we said before about shalom, right? It means to be different, to stand out, to be singular, to be able to see God, remember God, recognize God when everybody else seemingly has forgot. And the job of the prophet is to find a way, to find the language, to bring the language of God, the prophecy of God to the people, to bring them back to God. At the end of the day, sometimes the simplest step of what it means to be Jewish is, just to, again, make sure you're out of place, to recognize that everything that's going on out there, that you can't be fully with that, right? You have to find a way to kind of realize that you're out of step with it in some sense. So what you see here, again, are very much the themes that will animate Rosenzweig's life. And next year, we'll look at the conversion, or the conversion that wasn't, and try to understand. He almost goes through with it, but why doesn't he? And what are the kernels of his thought that emerge from that experience, again, that can continue to get us thinking today. And the last thing I'll say too is I open by saying that Rosenzweig's time wasn't that different from our own, right? He's right. Jews across the world, are stuck in this position of assimilation. What does it mean to be Jewish? Maybe they run to Reform, maybe they run to ultra Orthodoxy, but trying to find an authentic way to be Jewish in the world, in the moment that we're in, when the world is turning itself upside down, is not such an easy question. But it's in times like this that we have to turn to prophetic figures who can help us find a way back to God, and ultimately help us find a way back to God's Torah and what God wants from us in this world.